I need to talk to you face to face, because this isn't something I can explain with distance between us. Some things lose their truth when they're typed. Some words only make sense when you can see someone's eyes, hear the pause, feel the weight behind the silence. You already know this conversation is coming. You felt it in the way things changed, in the moments we didn't finish our sentences. This isn't about drama, it's about honesty. I need you in front of me, because what I'm about to say can't be misunderstood, edited, or ignored. It's something that changes how we move forward, together or apart. And if I'm going to say it, I want you to hear it from me, not through a screen, not through assumptions, face to face. When I said we needed to talk face to face, it wasn't because I wanted intensity, it was because I wanted accuracy. Distance distorts things. Screens flatten meaning. And what I needed to say deserved to arrive whole, not fragmented by interpretation. I've learned over time that the most important conversations aren't urgent because of emotion, but because of consequence. They alter direction, they redraw boundaries, they clarify intent. And I could feel that we were standing at one of those moments, whether we acknowledged it or not. I noticed it in the pauses, in the way our conversations became more careful, in how certain topics circled us but never landed. Not because we were afraid, but because we both knew that once spoken aloud, things wouldn't stay the same. Some truths don't explode, they settle. And once they do, you can't pretend they aren't there. That's why this couldn't happen casually. I didn't want to deliver words and then disappear behind silence. I didn't want you filling in gaps with assumptions. I wanted you to see that this wasn't impulsive. It was considered, thought through, weighed. I've spent most of my life learning how to make decisions without emotional noise. But this wasn't a decision I wanted to make alone. It involved you, not as a variable, but as a person whose presence mattered in the outcome. I started replaying moments in my head, small ones, ordinary ones, the kind people usually overlook, how you listened without interrupting, how you didn't rush to fix things that weren't broken, how you asked questions that weren't about control but understanding. Those patterns stayed with me, and they led me to a realization I couldn't ignore anymore. Whatever this was becoming, it deserved honesty, not convenience. Talking in person forces responsibility. You can't hide behind timing. You can't soften things with emojis or avoid reaction. You say what you mean, and you stay present for the response. That's respect. And I respect you too much to do this any other way. I thought about what it would mean to stay silent, to let momentum decide, to let things drift without definition. And for a moment that path looked easier. Ambiguity always does. It asks nothing immediately, but it costs you later. I didn't want us to become a question mark. I didn't want to look back and realize that the moment for clarity had passed because I chose comfort over truth. That's not how I operate. It is not how I want to relate to someone who matters. So I asked to see you, not to confront, not to persuade, but to be clear, because clarity is an act of care. I know that face-to-face conversations carry risk. You can't control how they land. You can't retract what's said once it's heard. But that's also what makes them real. They demand presence from both sides, and I trusted you with that. I trusted that even if what I said wasn't what you hoped to hear, you'd respect the honesty behind it, that you'd recognize the intention, not to disrupt, but to align. As the moment approached, I wasn't nervous. I was focused, not rehearsing lines, but grounding myself in truth, making sure that what I said would reflect what I'd already been living, consistently, not dramatically. Because the point wasn't to change everything instantly, it was to stop pretending nothing was changing at all. When I look at you, I don't see someone I want to convince. I see someone I want to stand in front of, without defense, without performance. Just clarity. That's why this had to be in person. Because whatever direction this takes, I want it to begin with something solid. Two people choosing to face each other honestly, without filters, without delay. And once that choice is made, the conversation doesn't just happen, it matters. When we finally sat across from each other, the room felt different. Not heavy, attentive. Like the space itself was waiting. There was no rush to speak, no need to fill the silence. We both understood that whatever came next would carry weight, and weight doesn't need volume. I remember noticing the small details first. The way you sat still, instead of reaching for your phone. The way your eyes stayed on mine, not searching for exits or distractions. That told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. You were present. That's rare, and it confirmed why this conversation mattered enough to happen face to face. I didn't begin with conclusions. I began with context. I talked about time not in terms of how long we'd known each other, but how consistently our paths had intersected, how patterns had formed without force, how certain things had remained steady even when circumstances shifted. I explained that I wasn't there to demand answers. I was there to acknowledge something real. Pretending it wasn't there felt dishonest, and dishonesty erodes connection faster than conflict ever could. You listen without interrupting, not passively, actively. The kind of listening where someone isn't waiting to respond but genuinely absorbing what's being said. That alone told me I'd made the right choice by insisting on this moment. I spoke about clarity, how I don't believe in dragging people through uncertainty when intention can be stated plainly. Ambiguity might feel safe, but it creates distance over time. And distance, once normalized, becomes difficult to undo. I told you I didn't want to misrepresent myself through silence. What I didn't do was dramatize the moment. I didn't exaggerate emotion. I didn't frame things as irreversible, because honesty doesn't need pressure to be effective. I watched your expression change, not in shock, but in recognition, as if something you'd already sensed was finally being named. That's when I realized we weren't having two different conversations. We were arriving at the same one from different directions. You asked thoughtful questions, not defensive ones, questions that showed you were considering implications, not just outcomes. You weren't looking for reassurance, you were looking for alignment. That mattered to me. I responded carefully, not because I was uncertain, but because I respected the moment. Face-to-face conversations require pacing. You let meaning land before adding more. You allow space for reaction. You stay present even when the silence stretches, and we did. That mattered to me. I responded carefully, not because I was uncertain, but because I respected the moment. Face-to-face conversations require pacing. You let meaning land before adding more. You allow space for reaction. You stay present even when the silence stretches. And we did. At one point I paused, not because I'd run out of words, but because I wanted to make sure what I was saying matched what I was prepared to live. Spoken truth is only powerful when it's backed by behavior. I told you I wasn't asking for a decision in that moment. I was offering transparency. I wanted you to have the same information I have been carrying, without obligation, without urgency. You didn't flinch. You acknowledged the weight of it, not with fear, but with honesty. You didn't rush to label it. You didn't retreat into humor or deflection. You stayed. That told me more than any answer could have. The conversation didn't end with certainty. It ended with clarity. And those two things aren't the same. Certainty closes doors. Clarity opens them. We stood up differently than we'd sat down. Not lighter, more aligned. There was no dramatic resolution, no instant future mapped out. But there was something more valuable, mutual understanding. And as we walked away, I knew something had shifted, not because we'd decided everything, but because we'd chosen to meet reality together, without filters, without distance. That's what face-to-face conversations do when they're done right. They don't force outcomes. They create honesty. After that conversation, nothing looked the same, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing was unspoken anymore. There's a strange calm that comes after honesty. Not relief exactly, but alignment. The feeling that whatever comes next will at least be real. I noticed it in the way time moved afterward. Moments didn't feel rushed. Decisions didn't feel forced. There was no urgency to define everything immediately, because the most important thing had already been done. Truth had been placed on the table, and neither of us had turned away from it. That matters. I started reflecting on why that conversation felt so different from so many others I'd had in my life. It wasn't just the content. It was the mutual willingness to stay present without control. No one was trying to steer the outcome. No one was trying to win. We were trying to understand. And understanding creates space. I thought about how often people talk past each other because they're negotiating security instead of sharing reality. They say what protects them, not what represents them. But face to face, there's nowhere to hide. Your tone, your pauses, your posture, they all speak. And what you communicated without words was steadiness. You didn't need certainty to remain grounded. You didn't need reassurance to stay engaged. You were comfortable letting something exist in an unfinished state without collapsing into anxiety or pressure. That showed emotional maturity. I realized that this conversation wasn't a turning point because of what was said. It was a turning point because of how it was handled. Two people choosing presence over performance, patience over pressure, truth over tactics. That's rare. As days passed, I noticed how my own behavior shifted. I wasn't replaying the conversation looking for mistakes. I wasn't second-guessing tone or wording. That's how I knew it had been honest. When something is aligned, it doesn't echo with regret. Instead, there was clarity. Clarity about boundaries. Clarity about intention. Clarity about the pace things needed to move. Not fast, not slow, but right. I began to understand that face-to-face conversations don't exist to create instant outcomes. They exist to establish a foundation strong enough to support whatever outcome eventually forms. And that foundation had been set. I also recognized something else. By choosing to meet in person, we had both accepted responsibility. Responsibility for how our words landed. Responsibility for how silence was interpreted. Responsibility for not hiding behind distance if things became uncomfortable. That kind of responsibility changes how you relate. I found myself more attentive, more deliberate, not because I was trying harder, but because awareness had increased. When truth is shared, you don't move casually anymore. You move consciously. I paid attention to how we communicated afterward. There was less assumption, less projection, more asking, more listening. The noise had dropped away. That's what clarity does. It simplifies. I also saw how that moment protected us from future confusion. There was no need to wonder what the other person meant. No need to read between lines. The lines had been spoken clearly. That doesn't guarantee ease, but it guarantees honesty. And honesty is the only thing that makes complexity manageable. I thought about how many connections fail not because of incompatibility, but because of avoidance, because people wait too long to speak, because they choose comfort over courage, because they hope clarity will arrive on its own.
It doesn't.
It has to be invited. That's what we did. And the result wasn't certainty, it was respect. Respect for each other's capacity to handle truth. Respect for the moment. Respect for the possibility of what could grow when things are named instead of hidden. I realized then that regardless of where this leads, that conversation had already done something meaningful. It had established a standard, a way of relating that doesn't rely on guessing or games.
Face to face, present, honest.
That standard changes everything that follows, because once you know you can meet someone there, really meet them, you stop settling for anything less. And that's when I understood this wasn't just a conversation, it was a commitment to clarity. After that moment of clarity, the future didn't rush toward us, it unfolded, slowly, deliberately, the way things do when they're no longer driven by uncertainty, but by choice. I noticed how differently I carried myself afterward. There was no lingering tension, no unfinished sentence hanging in the air. When truth is spoken face to face, it grounds you. It anchors your next steps. You stop guessing and you start responding to what's actually there. What mattered most to me was that neither of us tried to control the narrative that followed. We didn't rush to define outcomes. We didn't force timelines. We allowed understanding to settle before deciding what it meant. That patience wasn't passive, it was intentional. Because rushing clarity often destroys it. I thought a lot about trust during that time, not trust as a promise, but trust as behavior. The kind that shows up in how you respect someone's pace, how you don't punish honesty with pressure, how you allow space without interpreting it as distance. You did that, and so did I. We gave each other room to process without withdrawing. We stayed connected without hovering. That balance is difficult to maintain, but it's essential when something real is forming. Too much force fractures it. Too little presence lets it fade. We found the middle. I also realized something important. Face-to-face conversations don't end when the meeting ends. They continue in how you behave afterward, in whether your actions stay aligned with your words, and whether you remain accountable to the clarity you created. I stayed aware of that. I didn't say anything I wasn't prepared to live, and I didn't live in ways that contradicted what I'd said. Consistency is the quiet proof of sincerity. Without it, even the most honest conversation loses meaning. I saw that same consistency in you. You didn't change tone, you didn't test boundaries, you didn't seek reassurance disguised as questions. I also understood that this kind of connection doesn't thrive on constant intensity, it thrives on reliability. On knowing that when something needs to be said, it will be said directly. When something needs attention, it won't be avoided. That standard had been set the moment we chose to talk face to face, and standards once established shape everything. I didn't feel the need to overanalyze what came next. The path forward wasn't hidden. It was simply unwritten. And there's a difference. Hidden paths create anxiety. Unwritten ones invite intention. We were no longer reacting to ambiguity. We were responding to reality. I noticed how that affected the way I thought about you. There was no pedestal, no projection, just clarity. Seeing you as you are, thoughtful, grounded, capable of holding complexity without collapsing into it. That kind of presence doesn't need urgency to stay meaningful. I also reflected on how many connections never reach this point because one or both people avoid the moment that demands courage, the moment where you stop managing impressions and start telling the truth, face to face. We didn't avoid it, and because of that, whatever grows from here won't be fragile. It won't be built on assumptions or unspoken expectations. It will be built on something far more durable, mutual accountability. I don't know exactly where this leads, and I don't need to. What matters is how we've chosen to walk forward. With honesty, with presence, without distance. That's what that conversation created, not an answer, but a foundation. And foundations don't rush, they hold. Whatever comes next will stand on that, steady, intentional, and real. In the end, what mattered most wasn't the words we exchanged, it was the courage behind them. Choosing to speak face to face wasn't about resolving everything in a single moment. It was about respecting what we were building enough to face it honestly. That conversation didn't give us a perfect map forward. It gave us something better, alignment, a shared understanding that whatever comes next should be rooted in truth, not assumptions, in clarity, not silence, in intention, not fear. I realized that real connections don't need constant reassurance. They need consistency. They need two people willing to show up the same way after the conversation as they did during it. And that's exactly what we did. We didn't retreat. We didn't overcompensate. We stayed steady. There's strength in that kind of balance. From that point on, everything felt lighter, not because it became less serious, but because it became more real. There was no longer a need to guess what was unsaid or read between the lines. What mattered was already on the table, acknowledged and respected, and that's rare. Most people avoid moments like that because they fear what might change. But sometimes what changes is exactly what needs to. Sometimes clarity doesn't end something, it strengthens it. It strips away uncertainty and leaves behind something solid enough to grow. That's what happened here. In the end, what mattered most wasn't the words we exchanged, it was the courage behind them. Choosing to speak face to face wasn't about resolving everything in a single moment. It was about respecting what we were building enough to face it honestly. Our conversation didn't give us a perfect map forward. It gave us something better, alignment, a shared understanding that whatever comes next should be rooted in truth, not assumptions, in clarity, not silence, in intention, not fear. I realized that real connections don't need constant reassurance. They need consistency. They need two people willing to show up the same way after the conversation as they did during it. And that's exactly what we did. We didn't retreat. We didn't overcompensate. We stayed steady. There's strength in that kind of balance. From that point on, everything felt lighter, not because it became less serious, but because it became more real. There was no longer a need to guess what was unsaid or read between the lines. What mattered was already on the table, acknowledged and respected. And that's rare. Most people avoid moments like that because they fear what might change. But sometimes what changes is exactly what needs to. Sometimes clarity doesn't end something, it strengthens it. It strips away uncertainty and leaves behind something solid enough to grow. That's what happened here. I don't need to rush the future to feel confident about it. I trust the foundation we set. I trust the honesty we chose. And I trust the way we handled something meaningful without letting it become fragile. Whatever this becomes, it will be intentional, it will be grounded, and it will be built on a moment where we chose courage over comfort. That choice already says everything. I don't need to rush the future to feel confident about it. I trust the foundation we set, I trust the honesty we chose, and I trust the way we handled something meaningful without letting it become fragile. Whatever this becomes, it will be intentional, it will be grounded, and it will be built on a moment where we chose courage over comfort. That choice already says everything.